The coffee maker gurgled its familiar tune at 5:15 in the morning, filling the cramped apartment with the only warmth Garrett Dawson would feel before stepping into another 16-hour day. He stood at the kitchen counter, his calloused hands wrapped around a chip mug bearing the faded logo of Rosie's Diner, where he'd been pulling double shifts for longer than he cared to remember. 3 years. That's how long it had been since Meredith took her last breath in that hospital bed, her hand growing cold in his, while machines beeped their final protests. 3 years of scraping by, of watching every penny, of telling his son that things would get better, while wondering if he was telling the truth. The apartment was small. 2 bedrooms that barely deserved the name a bathroom, with a shower that only produced hot water if you caught it at exactly the right moment, and a kitchen where the refrigerator hummed with the strain of keeping their meager provisions fresh. The handle had been held together with electrical tape for 6 months now. Garrett kept meaning to fix it properly, but proper fixes cost money, and money was something they didn't have. He heard the soft padding of feet in the hallway before he saw his son. Caleb appeared in the doorway, his dark hair tousled from sleep, holding up a pair of sneakers that had seen better days. At 9 years old, the boy possessed his mother's gentle eyes and his father's stubborn chin, a combination that broke Garrett's heart and gave him strength in equal measure. "Dad, my shoes don't fit anymore." Garrett set down his coffee and knelt to examine the worn sneakers. The soles were separating from the uppers, and Caleb's toes were clearly cramped against the front. Another expense they couldn't afford. Another reminder of how far they'd fallen since Meredith's medical bills had consumed everything they'd saved. "We'll figure something out, buddy." He said the words automatically, the same words he'd been saying for 3 years. "We'll figure it out. Things will get better. Don't worry." The vocabulary of a father who had nothing left to give except hope, and even that was running low. The stack of bills on the kitchen counter told the real story. Overdue notices from the electric company, final warnings from the landlord, a letter from the collection agency handling Meredith's hospital debt, politely informing him that they would be taking legal action if payment wasn't received within 30 days. The life insurance payout had disappeared into the medical debt black hole within 6 months of her death. Everything they'd saved for Caleb's future, for their future gone, swallowed by a system that charged $40 for a single aspirin and called it healthcare. Garrett prepared his son's lunch with the mechanical efficiency of a man who had performed this ritual hundreds of times. Peanut butter sandwich, an apple that had seen better days, a juice box from the discount store. He placed everything in Caleb's backpack with care, as if these humble items were precious treasures rather than the bare minimum a father should provide. The phone rang at 6:30, its shrill tone cutting through the morning quiet like a blade. Garrett glanced at the caller ID and felt his stomach drop. Vivian Hargrove, his late wife's mother. She never called with good news. "Hello, Vivian." "Garrett, we need to talk." Her voice carried the same imperious tone that had made family gatherings uncomfortable, even when Meredith was alive. "Preston and I have been discussing Caleb's situation." "What situation would that be?" "Don't play games with me. The boy is living in poverty while you chase your pride around that worthless job of yours. It's time to face reality." Garrett closed his eyes, feeling the familiar weight of his in-law's judgment pressing down on him. Preston and Vivian Hargrove had married into money when their daughter Elena wed into the Hargrove construction empire. They'd tolerated Garrett when Meredith was alive barely. But since her death, they'd made their feelings crystal clear. He wasn't good enough for their daughter, and he certainly wasn't good enough to raise their grandson. Caleb is fine where he is. Fine. Living in that cramped apartment wearing clothes from Goodwill. Eating government-subsidized lunches at school. We can give him opportunities, Garrett. Private school. A college fund. A real future. The words stung because they contained enough truth to cut deep. Garrett had been thinking the same thoughts during his sleepless nights, wondering if his pride was standing in the way of what was best for Caleb. But every time he considered their offer, he remembered Meredith's dying words whispered with the last of her strength as the monitors screamed their warnings. Don't let them take him from you. He needs his father. Promise me, Garrett. Promise me you'll fight for him. I'm his father, Garrett said quietly into the phone. Are you, or are you just a man too stubborn to admit when he's beaten? After the call ended, Garrett sat at the kitchen table and stared at the stack of bills that seemed to grow taller every day. Outside the window, the sun was rising over the parking lot of their apartment complex, casting long shadows across cracked asphalt and rusting cars. This was their world now. This was what remained of the life he and Meredith had built together. But today would be different. Today he had received a letter that might change everything. The envelope had arrived 3 days ago, bearing the letterhead of Morrison and Associates Attorneys at Law. Inside was a formal notification that his grandfather, Theodore Dawson, had passed away at the age of 78, and that Garrett had been named as the sole beneficiary of his estate. Estate. The word almost made him laugh. Theodore Dawson had been a dreamer, a tinkerer, a man who spent his entire life working on inventions that never quite made it to market. He'd lived alone on a farmhouse outside of town for as long as Garrett could remember, becoming increasingly reclusive in his later years. The family had lost touch with him decades ago, and Garrett had only vague childhood memories of visiting the old man's workshop, watching those weathered hands manipulate tools and wires with remarkable precision. The inheritance consisted of one item: a farmhouse on 15 acres of land in rural Texas. Garrett had driven out to see the place last week, and the sight had nearly broken his resolve. The farmhouse sagged like a tired old man, its roof patched with mismatched shingles, its front porch supported by makeshift wooden posts that looked ready to collapse at any moment. The barn had partially caved in, and the fields were overgrown with weeds and volunteer saplings that stretched toward a gray sky. The county assessor had generously described the structure as uninhabitable. The bank was already making inquiries about the 3 months of back taxes that Theodore had left unpaid, and the whole town, Garrett had learned from a gas station attendant, referred to the property as the junk farm. But as he'd walked through the empty rooms that day, feeling the solid bones of the old house beneath layers of neglect, something had stirred inside him. These walls had been built by his family. His grandfather's hands had shaped this place, had carved a life from nothing more than determination and hope. There was history here, even if everyone else saw only decay. Dad. Caleb's voice brought him back to the present. Mrs. Henderson says we might have to move again. Mrs. Henderson was their landlord's wife who lived in the unit below them. The woman had a kind heart, but a practical mind, and she'd been dropping hints about the rising rent and Garrett's increasingly late payments. "Don't worry about Mrs. Henderson. We'll be fine." The words felt hollow even as he spoke them. They both knew the truth. The eviction notice would come eventually. It was just a matter of time. That afternoon, Garrett picked Caleb up from school early. He'd called in sick to the diner for the first time in 6 months, telling his manager there was a family emergency. It wasn't entirely a lie. They drove in silence through familiar streets that gave way to open fields and scattered farmhouses. Caleb pressed his face against the window, watching the world change from concrete and strip malls to rolling hills and endless sky. "Where are we going, Dad?" "To see your great-grandfather's house. To see if it's really as bad as everyone says it is." The farmhouse looked even worse in the harsh light of afternoon than it had during Garrett's brief visit the week before. The roof sagged in 2 distinct places. The front steps were rotted through and several windows were boarded up with plywood that had warped and split over the years. The barn had lost more of its roof since his last visit, and the fields stretched toward the horizon in a tangle of weeds and neglect. But Caleb saw something different. The boy climbed out of the truck and walked toward the house with the careful steps of an explorer discovering new territory. His small hands traced the weathered porch railings, and his eyes took in the tall windows that had been built to catch the morning light. "It's big," Caleb said, his voice filled with wonder rather than disappointment. "It's falling down," Garrett replied, but there was no conviction in his voice. They walked the property together, father and son taking inventory of the damage and the possibilities. The workshop behind the house was in better condition than the main structure, its thick stone walls and slate roof having weathered the years with more dignity. Inside, Garrett found his grandfather's tools arranged on pegboard walls, with the precision of a man who had spent his life building things with his hands. Caleb ran his fingers along the dusty workbench, leaving tracks in the accumulated grime of years. "What did Great-Grandpa make here?" "I don't know," Garrett admitted. "Your grandmother used to say he was always working on something, but I never knew what." They climbed the creaking stairs to the second floor of the farmhouse, testing each step carefully. The bedrooms were small but well-proportioned with dormer windows that looked out over fields that seemed to stretch forever. In what had been the master bedroom, Garrett found a dresser still filled with his grandfather's clothes as if the old man had simply stepped out for a moment and planned to return. "Dad," Caleb called from the smaller bedroom. "Look at this." Garrett found his son standing in front of a window that faced west toward distant mountains rising purple against the afternoon sky. The view was spectacular. A panorama of rolling hills and open country that seemed to promise possibilities their cramped apartment could never offer. In the foreground, an ancient oak tree spread its branches over what had once been a vegetable garden. Its trunk was thick enough for a boy to climb, and its canopy was wide enough to shade half the yard. "I could have a tree house," Caleb said quietly, more hope in those 4 words than Garrett had heard from his son in months. "You could," Garrett agreed, something shifting in his chest. They stood there together for a long moment, looking out at land that had been in their family for 3 generations. The farmhouse might be a ruin, but it was their ruin. The fields might be overgrown, but they were their fields. For the first time since Meredith's death, Garrett felt the possibility of building something instead of just surviving. "What do you think, buddy?" he asked. "Should we take a chance on this place?" Caleb looked up at his father with eyes that held more hope than fear. "I think Great-Grandpa would want us to fix it up." That evening, as they drove back to their apartment, Garrett made a decision that would change everything. He would cash out his meager 401k. He would pay the back taxes on the farmhouse, and he would move them in before Preston and Vivian Hargrove could make good on their threats to take Caleb away. The $347 in his savings account wouldn't go far. His checking account was already overdrawn. But the farmhouse represented something more valuable than money. It was a chance, a possibility, a place where a man could stand on his own land and tell the world that he had something worth fighting for. "Are you sure about this?" Caleb asked as they pulled into their apartment complex for what might be one of the last times. Garrett looked at his son, saw Meredith's courage reflected in those dark eyes, and felt his grandfather's determination flowing through his veins. "I'm sure. We're going to make this work." The move happened faster than either of them expected. Within 2 weeks, Garrett had liquidated everything they owned of value, paid the back taxes to the county, and loaded their possessions into a rented moving truck. The apartment was easy to leave. It had never really been home. The first night in the farmhouse tested every ounce of determination Garrett possessed. The moving truck had departed that afternoon, leaving their meager possessions scattered across the living room like driftwood after a storm. The electricity worked barely, but the ancient wiring created an ominous humming in the walls that made Caleb nervous. The water ran brown for 10 minutes before clearing, and the heating system wheezed like an old man climbing stairs. "Dad, there's a drip in my room," Caleb called from upstairs, his voice echoing through the empty house. Garrett climbed the creaking stairs with a bucket and a collection of towels, finding his son standing beneath a growing water stain on the ceiling. The October rain had started just after sunset, a steady drumbeat that revealed every weakness in the farmhouse's defenses. Within an hour, they had positioned containers throughout the second floor to catch the various leaks. "Maybe we should sleep downstairs tonight," Garrett suggested. But Caleb shook his head with stubborn determination. "I want to sleep in my room. It's my room now." "Right?" "Right," Garrett agreed, spreading a tarp over Caleb's mattress and positioning the bucket beside the bed. "We'll fix the roof tomorrow." Around midnight, the storm intensified. Garrett lay awake in the master bedroom, listening to the house groan and creak around him like a ship in rough seas. The wind howled through gaps in the windows, and rain hammered against the roof with increasing fury. He thought about Meredith, about the promise he had made to her, about whether he was doing the right thing by bringing Caleb to this falling-down farmhouse instead of accepting help from people who could give the boy a comfortable life. But comfort wasn't everything. Meredith had understood that. She had grown up with the Hargroves' money, had seen how it poisoned everything it touched. Her father, Preston, had sold his soul to the family business, becoming nothing more than a puppet for the patriarch Winston Hargrove. Her mother, Vivian, had forgotten what it meant to struggle to earn, to build something with your own hands. Meredith had chosen Garrett specifically because he wasn't part of that world. She had loved him for his calloused hands and his honest work and his refusal to compromise his principles for money. She would have wanted Caleb to grow up the same way. A crash from upstairs shattered his thoughts. Garrett was out of bed and running toward Caleb's room before the echo faded. He found his son sitting up in bed, wide-eyed and pointing toward the corner where a section of ceiling plaster had given way to the persistent leak. Water poured through the opening, splashing onto the floor and revealing the wooden slats and horsehair insulation beneath. "I'm sorry, Dad," Caleb said, his voice small in the darkness. "I know we don't have money to fix it." Garrett knelt beside the bed, brushing wet plaster dust from his son's hair. "It's not your fault, buddy. Houses this old, they have their own way of talking to us. What's it saying? It's saying it needs help, and we're going to help it." They moved Caleb's mattress to the living room, setting up a temporary bedroom near the fireplace where the ceiling was solid and dry. As his son finally drifted off to sleep, Garrett sat in his grandfather's old recliner, listening to the rain and the house's symphony of creaks and groans. He should have felt defeated. Everything about their situation suggested failure. But instead, Garrett felt something unexpected: purpose. For the first time in 3 years, he had something to fight for beyond mere survival. He had a house to restore, land to reclaim, and a legacy to honor. The morning came gray and cold, with the storm having passed some time before dawn. Garrett stood in Caleb's damaged room, staring at the hole in the ceiling and calculating repair costs he couldn't afford. The leak had revealed more than just damaged plaster. The roof decking was rotted in several places. The insulation was contaminated with water damage, and the electrical wiring that ran through the wall looked like it hadn't been updated since the Eisenhower administration. "Dad, look what I found." Caleb's voice came from the corner of the room where the boy was crouched beside the damaged wall. His small fingers were tracing the edge of a wooden panel that had come loose during the night's excitement. The panel was about 2 feet square, set into the wall at child height, and it had shifted just enough to reveal a dark space behind it. "Careful," Garrett warned, crossing the room quickly. But Caleb had already worked his fingers into the gap and was pulling the panel free. "There's something back here, something hidden." Garrett took the flashlight from his back pocket and peered into the opening his son had discovered. The space behind the panel was larger than he'd expected, carved out between the wall studs to create a hidden compartment about the size of a small closet. The beam of his flashlight caught the edge of what looked like paper. Lots of paper, tied with string and wrapped in oilcloth. "What is it?" Caleb asked, bouncing on his toes with anticipation. Garrett reached into the cavity and carefully extracted the first bundle. The oilcloth was old, but intact, protecting whatever lay inside from decades of moisture and neglect. He set the bundle on Caleb's mattress and carefully unwrapped it, revealing a collection of papers covered in his grandfather's careful handwriting. The top page was dated 1967 and titled "Perpetual Energy Conversion System, Preliminary Design Notes." Below the title, Theodore Dawson's flowing script filled the page with diagrams, equations, and detailed observations about electromagnetic field manipulation and energy storage systems. Even to Garrett's untrained eye, the work looked sophisticated and purposeful. This wasn't the random tinkering of a hobbyist. This was the careful documentation of a serious inventor pursuing a specific goal. "Is it important?" Caleb asked, leaning over his father's shoulder to study the mysterious papers. I think it might be. Garrett said, his voice carrying a note of wonder he hadn't felt in years. They spent the entire morning exploring the hidden compartment, extracting bundle after bundle of documents. Theodore had been methodical in his record-keeping, dating each page, and organizing his work into categories that suggested a mind capable of remarkable focus and innovation. There were technical drawings that looked like patent applications. There was correspondence with universities and research institutions, letters from professors at MIT and Stanford praising his theoretical work. There were detailed journals documenting experiments conducted in the workshop behind the house. Experiments that seemed to involve harvesting energy from sources that shouldn't have been able to provide power. "Your great-grandfather was an inventor," Garrett told Caleb as they spread the blueprints across the living room floor. "A real inventor, not just someone who liked to tinker with tools. Like Thomas Edison. Maybe something like that." The deeper they dug into Theodore's hidden archive, the more impressive the scope of his work became. One collection of documents described what Theodore had called the Dawson Regenerative Energy System. The drawings showed a machine about the size of a washing machine designed to convert ambient electromagnetic energy into usable electrical power. According to the specifications, the device could harvest energy from radio waves, power line emissions, atmospheric electrical activity, and even the Earth's magnetic field. The collected energy would be processed through conditioning circuits and stored in batteries that could power an entire household indefinitely. Free electricity. That's what Theodore had been working toward. A way for ordinary families to generate their own power, without depending on utility companies or paying monthly bills that grew larger every year. "Why didn't anyone know about this?" Caleb asked. Garrett was wondering the same thing. The correspondence suggested that Theodore's work had been taken seriously by academic institutions. One letter from a professor at MIT called his theoretical insights revolutionary and decades ahead of current research. Another from Stanford expressed interest in collaboration on practical applications. But something had gone wrong. The correspondence ended abruptly in 1972. The patent applications appeared to have never been filed, and the workshop experiments seemed to have been abandoned mid-project, as if Theodore had simply walked away from his life's work one day and never returned. The final document in the collection was a letter addressed to my future family dated just 6 months before Theodore's death. In it, the old man explained that he had hidden his work because powerful interests had tried to steal it from him. He had refused to let his innovations be used for profit without proper compensation, and he had chosen to wait for a time when his family might be able to claim what was rightfully theirs. "The energy crisis will come," Theodore had written in his careful script. "When it does, the world will need solutions that serve people, not just corporations. My inventions were meant to help families power their homes without dependence on utility companies. Someday, someone in our family will understand their value and find a way to bring them to the world." As Garrett read those words, he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the farmhouse's drafty windows. Theodore hadn't left them a burden. He'd left them a treasure. The question was whether they possessed the intelligence, determination, and resources to claim it. That afternoon, while Caleb organized the documents by date with the meticulous care of a born researcher, Garrett walked to the workshop behind the house. The stone building had weathered the decades better than the main structure, its thick walls and heavy slate roof providing protection that the farmhouse's more modest construction couldn't match. Inside the workshop looked exactly as Theodore must have left it. Tools hung on pegboard walls in perfect order. Workbenches lined three sides of the room covered with electronic components, metal fabrication equipment, and measuring instruments that looked more sophisticated than anything Garrett had expected to find. And in one corner, covered by a canvas tarp, he discovered something remarkable. The device was about the size of a large toolbox, its construction elegant and precise. Hand-wound copper coils gleamed beneath a protective housing. Carefully machined metal components fit together with the kind of attention to detail that suggested both technical skill and artistic sensibility. Electronic circuits had been assembled with patience and precision, each connection clean and purposeful. According to the corresponding journal entries, this was Theodore's proof-of-concept energy converter, a working prototype designed to demonstrate the basic principles of his larger system. Garrett found the power switch among the device's controls and hesitated with his finger hovering over it. The machine had been sitting dormant for decades. There was no reason to believe it would still function. And yet, looking at the careful construction, the obvious craftsmanship, he found himself hoping. He flipped the switch. Nothing happened for several seconds. Then gradually a soft humming filled the workshop. A series of small lights began to glow along the device's control panel. The display showed numbers that meant nothing to Garrett, but the fact that the machine was doing something after all this time suggested that Theodore's engineering had been as solid as his theory. Following instructions from the journal entries, Garrett connected the device to a small light bulb, using wires that Theodore had clearly prepared for exactly this purpose. The bulb glowed with a steady, warm light. He checked the connections. No power cord. No batteries. No obvious energy source of any kind. According to the readings on the display panel, the machine was generating electrical current from ambient electromagnetic fields, exactly as Theodore's theories had predicted. "Dad," Caleb's voice came from the workshop doorway. The boy had followed him, unable to contain his curiosity. "Is it working?" Garrett looked at the glowing light bulb, at the humming machine, at the decades of careful work that his grandfather had hidden away, waiting for this moment. "Yes," he said quietly. "I think your great-grandfather really did figure out how to make electricity from thin air." They stood together in the workshop, father and son, watching the proof-of-concept device work its quiet magic. The light bulb continued to glow. The machine continued to hum. And somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled as another storm approached. "Dad," Caleb said, slipping his hand into his father's, "are we going to be okay?" Garrett thought about his grandfather's hidden legacy, about the innovations that could change millions of lives, if properly developed, about the powerful interest that Theodore had warned about in his final letter. He thought about Meredith, about the promise he had made to her, about the life she had wanted for their son. He thought about the Hargroves, about their money, and their lawyers and their determination to take Caleb away from him. And he realized that for the first time since his wife's death, he had something more valuable than hope. He had a weapon. He had leverage. He had the work of a brilliant man who had trusted his family to carry his dreams forward. "Yes, buddy," Garrett said, squeezing his son's hand. I think we're going to be better than okay." Outside the workshop windows, the October wind was picking up, sending leaves skittering across the overgrown yard. The old oak tree swayed in the gusts, its branches reaching toward a darkening sky. The farmhouse stood against the gathering storm, battered but unbroken, keeping watch over secrets that had waited 50 years to be discovered. Garrett looked at his son at the workshop filled with Theodore's legacy, at the path that lay ahead of them. It wouldn't be easy. There would be battles to fight, obstacles to overcome, enemies to face. But for the first time in 3 years, Garrett Dawson felt ready to fight. Not just for survival, for something bigger, for family. The November morning brought frost to the farmhouse windows and a painful reminder of how much work lay ahead. Garrett stood in the kitchen nursing his second cup of coffee while studying his grandfather's journal entries by the pale light filtering through glass that hadn't been cleaned in decades. The pages were filled with technical diagrams and calculations that he couldn't fully understand, but the underlying vision was clear. Theodore Dawson had spent his life trying to free ordinary families from the burden of electric bills. Caleb sat at the scarred wooden table, carefully organizing the technical drawings they'd discovered. The boy had developed a systematic approach to cataloging Theodore's work, treating each document like a piece of a vast puzzle he was determined to solve. 9 years old and already showing the same methodical patience that his great-grandfather must have possessed. "Listen to this," Garrett said, reading from a journal entry dated 1969. "Today I achieved stable energy output for 6 consecutive hours. The electromagnetic resonance chamber maintains consistent field strength, even when drawing power for household applications. The power companies won't like what I'm building, but someday families will thank me for it." Caleb looked up from his sorting project with bright eyes. Great-grandpa knew he was making something important. He knew he just didn't live long enough to share it with the world. They had spent the past month learning to live with the farmhouse's many quirks, while diving deeper into Theodore's technical archives. Each day brought new discoveries that both excited and overwhelmed them. The proof of concept device in the workshop continued to function perfectly, generating enough electricity to power lights and small appliances without any external energy source. According to the blueprints, the full-scale system could power an entire house, maybe even a neighborhood. The possibilities were staggering, and apparently Garrett wasn't the only one who recognized them. A knock at the front door interrupted their morning research session. Through the grimy window, Garrett could see a white pickup truck with Henderson Construction painted on the doors, along with a sleek black sedan that looked out of place on the rural gravel road. 2 men climbed out of the sedan. One was a stranger in an expensive suit. The other was James Walsh, the son of their neighbor, Lorraine. Garrett opened the door, but didn't invite them in. "Morning, Garrett," James said, looking uncomfortable in his work clothes, standing next to the well-dressed stranger. "This is Bradley Fenwick from Meridian Development. He asked me to introduce him since you've been hard to reach by phone." Garrett's phone had been disconnected 2 weeks ago when he'd fallen behind on the bill. Another casualty of their financial situation. But he wasn't about to advertise that fact to strangers. "What can I do for you, gentlemen?" Bradley Fenwick stepped forward with the practiced smile of a professional deal maker. The kind of smile that promised friendship while calculating advantage. "Mr. Dawson, I represent investors who are interested in your property. We understand you've inherited a challenging situation, and we'd like to help you turn it into an opportunity. What kind of opportunity? The kind that puts cash in your pocket and relieves you of a burden you clearly can't afford to maintain. Fenwick gestured toward the farmhouse with its obvious repair needs. The sagging roof, the boarded windows, the porch that looked ready to collapse. This property requires significant investment to become habitable, and even then it's isolated from employment centers and good schools. We're prepared to offer you $200,000 for the land. That would allow you to relocate somewhere more suitable for raising a child. $200,000. The number hit Garrett like a physical blow. It was more money than he'd ever imagined having at one time. Enough to pay off every debt, buy a decent house in town, and provide Caleb with genuine stability for the first time since Meredith's death. It was also suspiciously generous for property the county assessor had valued at less than $50,000. That's a very generous offer, Garrett said carefully. What do you plan to do with the land residential development? The area is experiencing growth pressure from the city, and this property has excellent potential for subdivision into 5-acre parcels. 21st century families want space and privacy, and this location provides both. James Walsh shifted uncomfortably beside the developer. Garrett, I've known your family for 20 years. If you're thinking about selling, you should know that Meridian has been buying up properties all over this area. They're planning something big, but nobody knows exactly what. Fenwick's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. We're planning to bring economic development to a region that needs it. There's nothing sinister about legal real estate investment, Mr. Walsh. Legal, sure, James replied, but not necessarily good for the people who've lived here their whole lives. After the visitors left, Garrett stood at the kitchen window watching their vehicles disappear down the gravel road. $200,000. It would solve every immediate problem they faced. No more worrying about repairs or heating bills or whether the county would condemn the property as uninhabitable. But something about Fenwick's offer felt deeply wrong. The man had been too eager, too willing to pay far above market value for property he claimed to want for residential development. Real estate investors didn't overpay unless they knew something the seller didn't. Dad, are we going to sell the house? When Caleb had appeared silently beside him, his expression serious beyond his years. I don't know. What do you think? The boy considered the question with the same careful attention he brought to organizing his great-grandfather's documents. I think great-grandpa hid his inventions because he knew bad people might try to take them. Maybe those men today are the bad people he was worried about. Out of the mouths of babes, Garrett thought. His 9-year-old son had cut straight to the heart of his concerns. If Meridian Development was willing to pay premium prices for rural properties, they either knew something about the land's value that Garrett didn't, or they suspected the existence of something valuable on the property itself. The proof of concept device hummed quietly in the workshop, generating free electricity from invisible forces. If the wrong people learned about Theodore's inventions, they might do anything to control them, or to bury them forever. 3 days later, Lorraine Pruitt came walking up the gravel driveway carrying a covered dish and wearing the satisfied expression of someone who had important information to share. The elderly widow had lived on the neighboring property for 40 years, and she'd known Theodore Dawson better than almost anyone still alive. I brought you boys some cornbread, she announced when Garrett opened the door. "Figured you might be getting tired of canned soup and sandwiches." "That's very kind of you, Mrs. Pruitt. Please come in." Lorraine stepped into the farmhouse and looked around with the appraising eye of someone who remembered when the place had been well maintained. She'd been here countless times over the decades, sharing meals with Theodore, listening to his theories about energy and innovation, and the future of American families. "Place looks better already," she said diplomatically. Theodore would be pleased to see family living here again. "You knew my grandfather well." Oh, honey. Everyone knew Theodore. He was always willing to help when folks had problems with their electrical systems or needed something fixed. Smartest man in 3 counties, people used to say. Maybe the smartest man in Texas. Caleb emerged from the living room drawn by the smell of fresh cornbread. Lorraine's face lit up when she saw him. "And you must be Caleb. You look just like your grandmother did when she was your age. She used to play under that big oak tree for hours, building little houses out of sticks and leaves." "What did great-grandpa make in his workshop?" Caleb asked with his characteristic directness. Lorraine's expression grew thoughtful. "Hard to say exactly. Theodore was private about his projects. He'd tinker away in that workshop for days at a time, and then he'd get quiet whenever anyone asked what he was working on. Your grandmother used to tell me he was gonna change the world someday." "Why didn't he?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications that even a child could sense. Lorraine glanced at Garrett before answering, something flickering in her eyes that might have been old pain or old anger. "I think someone stopped him," she said quietly. "Theodore changed around 1972 or so. Got suspicious of everyone. Stopped talking about his work entirely. He once told me that there were people who made money by keeping things the same, and they didn't like inventors who threatened to make things different." After Lorraine left, Garrett sat with her words echoing in his mind. Someone had stopped Theodore from sharing his inventions with the world. Someone powerful enough to frighten a man who had spent his life pursuing truth and innovation. And now, 50 years later, someone was very interested in buying the property where those inventions had been hidden. The connection couldn't be coincidental. 2 weeks later, Garrett learned exactly how far his enemies were willing to go. He was in the workshop with Caleb studying the technical specifications for Theodore's full-scale energy system when they heard vehicles approaching on the gravel road. Multiple vehicles from the sound of it. Garrett moved to the workshop window and felt his blood run cold. 2 pickup trucks with Meridian Development logos. A sleek black sedan, and behind them, like wolves following a wounded deer, a white county sheriff's cruiser, and a gray government sedan. Bradley Fenwick emerged from the black sedan, but he wasn't alone this time. 3 men accompanied him, all wearing expensive clothes that looked out of place in rural Texas. One of them was older than the others, with silver hair and the commanding presence of someone accustomed to giving orders and having them obeyed. But it was the man's face that made Garrett's hands clench into fists. He recognized that face from photographs in Meredith's family albums. The strong jaw, the cold blue eyes, the expression of absolute confidence that came from decades of wealth and power. Winston Hargrove, the patriarch of the Hargrove Empire, Meredith's grandfather. The man who had built a fortune in construction and energy and had never forgiven his great-granddaughter for marrying a working-class nobody from the wrong side of town. Garrett stepped out of the workshop and walked toward the gathering with a calm he didn't feel. Behind him, he could sense Caleb watching from the doorway, ready to run if his father gave the signal. "Mr. Dawson," Fenwick began, but Winston Hargrove cut him off with a gesture. "I'll handle this, Bradley." The old man's voice carried the authority of someone who had spent 75 years getting exactly what he wanted. "Garrett, we need to talk. I don't believe we've ever been formally introduced, Mr. Hargrove." "No, we haven't. My granddaughter made sure of that." Winston's eyes swept over the farmhouse with undisguised contempt. "Meredith always did have a weakness for lost causes. I see she passed that trait on to her son. What do you want?" "I want to help you make the smart choice." Winston gestured toward the property, the workshop, the overgrown fields. "This place is worthless to you. You don't have the money to repair it, the knowledge to understand what Theodore was working on, or the resources to develop anything of value. But it's not worthless to me, because you know what my grandfather invented." Winston's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his cold blue eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or calculation. Theodore Dawson was a brilliant man with impractical dreams. He wasted his entire life pursuing technologies that the world wasn't ready for, and that threatened interests far more powerful than he understood. Is that why you tried to steal his work? Or did you actually succeed? The words hung in the air like a challenge. Behind Winston, Fenwick and the other men exchanged nervous glances. The sheriff, who had remained near his cruiser, shifted uncomfortably. Winston Hargrove smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I didn't come here to discuss ancient history. I came to make you an offer. $250,000 for this property. All debts cleared and a fresh start somewhere far from here. That's more than generous for land that's one good storm away from being condemned. And if I refuse, then I'll be forced to pursue other options." Winston glanced toward the sheriff's cruiser. "Your grandson is living in a structure that doesn't meet county safety codes. The heating system is inadequate, the electrical wiring is dangerous, and the roof could collapse at any moment. It would be irresponsible for the authorities to allow a child to remain in such conditions." Garrett felt cold rage building in his chest. "You're threatening to take my son away. I'm pointing out that you have responsibilities that extend beyond your pride. Caleb deserves better than this." Winston's voice hardened. "Preston and Vivian are prepared to provide him with everything he needs. Private schools, a college fund, opportunities that you can never give him. The question is whether you love that boy enough to let him go." Before Garrett could respond, a small voice spoke from behind him. "I don't want their money." Caleb had emerged from the workshop and was standing beside his father. His small hands clenched into fists, and his chin set with stubborn determination. The boy looked directly at Winston Hargrove without flinching. "This is my great-grandpa's house. He left it to us because he wanted us to have it. You can't just take it because you're rich." Winston studied the boy with an expression that might have been surprise or annoyance. "You should teach your son to respect his elders, Garrett." "I've taught my son to stand up for what's right, something your family seems to have forgotten how to do." The confrontation ended in stalemate, with Winston promising that Garrett would hear from his lawyers, and the county officials retreating to their vehicles with obvious relief. But as the convoy disappeared down the gravel road, Garrett knew that the battle was just beginning. They had drawn a line in the sand. Now they would have to defend it. The county inspection came 3 days later. A thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and an officious demeanor arrived with a clipboard and a camera accompanied by a deputy sheriff who looked apologetic, but determined to do his job. The inspector's name was Patterson, and he made it clear from the first moment that he was there to find problems. He found plenty. The roof had multiple areas of structural concern. The electrical wiring throughout the house was decades out of code. The heating system was inadequate for the square footage and posed potential fire hazards. Several windows were improperly sealed, creating energy efficiency violations. The plumbing showed signs of deterioration that could lead to water contamination. Patterson documented everything with photographs and detailed notes, his expression growing more satisfied with each violation he recorded. By the time he finished 3 hours later, he had compiled a list of deficiencies that would cost tens of thousands of dollars to address. Mr. Dawson, I'm required to inform you that this structure does not meet minimum habitability standards for a residence housing a minor child. Patterson's voice carried the flat satisfaction of a bureaucrat delivering bad news. You have 30 days to bring the property into compliance. If the necessary repairs are not completed, Child Protective Services will be notified, and appropriate action will be taken to ensure the minor's safety. After Patterson left, Garrett sat at the kitchen table staring at the inspection report while Caleb watched from across the room. 30 days. Tens of thousands of dollars in required repairs, and the implicit threat that if they failed, the state would take his son away. Winston Hargrove had made good on his promise. The wolves were no longer circling. They were at the door. The phone call from Colette Hargrove came that evening. Garrett almost didn't answer the unfamiliar number, but something made him pick up the old landline phone that Theodore had installed decades ago. Garrett, it's Colette. Meredith's older sister sounded nervous, her voice hushed as if she was afraid of being overheard. I need to talk to you, but you can't tell anyone I called. What's going on, Colette? My parents are hiring lawyers, custody specialists. They're going to use the inspection report to prove you're an unfit father. She paused, and Garrett could hear her breathing heavily on the other end of the line. Winston is behind all of it. He's been planning this for months, ever since he learned you inherited Theodore's property. Why does he care so much about this land? Silence stretched for a long moment before Colette answered. I don't know exactly, but I overheard him talking to Preston last week. He said something about patents and intellectual property and how Theodore's work could be worth more than anyone realizes. He called it unfinished business. Patents, intellectual property, unfinished business from 50 years ago. The pieces were beginning to fall into place. Colette, why are you telling me this? Because Meredith was my sister, and she loved you. She would have wanted me to warn you. Colette's voice cracked with emotion. And because I've seen what Winston does to people who get in his way. He destroyed Theodore's life 50 years ago, and he'll destroy yours too if you let him. After the call ended, Garrett sat in the darkness of the farmhouse kitchen, surrounded by his grandfather's documents and the weight of revelations he was only beginning to understand. Winston Hargrove had destroyed Theodore's life. That meant the old man had been involved in whatever had stopped Theodore from sharing his inventions with the world. But how? And why was he so desperate to control the property now, 5 decades later? The answer came from an unexpected source. Sutton Whitmore arrived at the farmhouse the following afternoon, driving a practical sedan and carrying a leather briefcase that had seen years of use. She was the head librarian at Caleb's school, a woman in her early 30s with intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that Garrett had come to appreciate during parent-teacher conferences. "Mr. Dawson, I hope you don't mind me stopping by unannounced," she said when he opened the door. "Caleb mentioned you've been researching your grandfather's work, and I thought you might be interested in these." She handed him a manila envelope thick with photocopied documents. "I've been helping the County Historical Society digitize old records, and I came across some correspondence involving Theodore Dawson. Letters from MIT, Stanford, even some international universities. I thought you should see them." Garrett invited her in, and Sutton's eyes widened as she took in the scene in the living room. Technical blueprints covered every flat surface. Journal pages were organized in careful stacks, and Caleb's school notebooks contained hand-drawn copies of his great-grandfather's diagrams, annotated with questions and observations in the boy's careful handwriting. "Caleb, this is incredible work," Sutton said, examining the boy's organizational system. "You've created a real research archive here." "Dad and I are trying to understand what great-grandpa invented," Caleb explained. "We think it might be important." Sutton opened the envelope she'd brought and spread the photocopied letters across the coffee table. The documents painted a picture of Theodore's reputation that Garrett had never fully grasped. Universities had sought his consultation on energy research projects. Government agencies had inquired about his theories. International organizations had invited him to speak at conferences on sustainable technology. "Your grandfather was famous," Sutton said simply. "Not celebrity famous, but famous among people who understood advanced energy systems. Look at this letter from Dr. Elizabeth Warren at M1T, not the politician, the physics professor. She's calling his work revolutionary and decades ahead of current research." Garrett studied the letter dated 1971, in which Dr. Warren expressed frustration that Theodore hadn't published his research or filed patents that would make his innovations available to the scientific community. "Mr. Dawson possesses insights into electromagnetic energy conversion that could transform how humanity approaches power generation," the professor had written. "His reluctance to share this knowledge with the broader research community is understandable, given current commercial pressures, but tragic from the perspective of human progress." "Why didn't he publish anything?" Garrett asked. Sutton pointed to another letter, this one from a patent attorney in Washington, D.C. "This might explain it. The attorney is warning your grandfather about industrial espionage and suggesting that premature disclosure could result in larger companies copying his work and using superior legal resources to claim ownership." "So great-grandpa was afraid someone would steal his inventions," Caleb said with his characteristic directness. "That's exactly what I think happened," Sutton replied. "The energy industry in the 1970s was dominated by very powerful companies that had strong reasons to prevent new technologies from disrupting their business models. Your grandfather was probably smart to keep his work private." As they discussed Theodore's situation, Garrett found himself impressed by Sutton's understanding of both the technical and commercial aspects of invention and intellectual property. She asked thoughtful questions about the blueprints, offered insights into the historical context of energy research, and demonstrated genuine enthusiasm for Caleb's systematic approach to cataloging the documents. "You know," Sutton said, "if you're serious about developing this technology, you're going to need help from people who understand patents and engineering and business development. My brother Douglas might be able to provide some guidance." "What kind of help could your brother offer?" "He's an intellectual property attorney in Houston, specializes in protecting inventors' rights against larger corporations. He's also interested in sustainable technology as both a professional and personal passion." Professional legal advice. The one thing Garrett knew he needed but couldn't possibly afford. "I appreciate the offer, but I can't afford Houston lawyers right now." Sutton smiled. "Douglas doesn't charge people who can't pay. He calls it his pro bono contribution to the future of American innovation. Let me give him a call and see if he'd be willing to take a look at your situation." 2 days later, Douglas Whitmore drove out to the farmhouse in a practical sedan, carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the quiet confidence of someone who had won difficult cases against powerful opponents. At 45, he had the kind of steady presence that inspired trust, with gray starting to appear at his temples and laugh lines around his eyes that suggested he found joy in his work, despite its challenges. For 3 hours, Douglas reviewed Theodore's technical archives, patent correspondence, and business documents with the focused attention of someone who understood exactly what he was looking at. He asked questions that Garrett couldn't answer and made notes in a leather-bound journal that seemed filled with similar investigations. Finally, he set down his pen and looked at Garrett with an expression that mixed excitement with concern. "Mr. Dawson, your grandfather's work is remarkable. These designs are sophisticated, practical, and potentially revolutionary. If the technology works as described, it could be worth more than you can imagine. But I need to do some research into the patent history before I can give you a complete picture. There are references in these documents to correspondence with attorneys and patent offices that suggest Theodore may have taken steps to protect his work that aren't immediately obvious. Give me a week to dig into the federal records, and I'll have a clearer idea of what we're dealing with." Douglas Whitmore kept his promise. 1 week later, he returned to the farmhouse with a cardboard box filled with documents he'd obtained from federal patent archives, corporate registration records, and court filing databases. His expression had changed from curious excitement to barely contained outrage. "Garrett, I found something that changes everything we thought we knew about this situation." He spread a series of documents across the kitchen table, photocopies of patent applications, corporate registrations, and legal filings spanning several decades. At first glance, they looked like routine paperwork, but Douglas's explanation revealed their explosive significance. "Your grandfather did file patents," Douglas said, "not under his own name but through a shell company called Dawson Innovation Technologies. He established the company in 1970, filed comprehensive patents for his energy systems in 1971, and those patents were approved by the U.S. Patent Office in 1973. Garrett stared at the documents, trying to process what he was hearing. "But I thought he never filed anything. That's why we were worried about proving his priority." "That's what someone wanted you to think." Douglas handed him a legal document dated 1974. 1 year after the patents were approved, Dawson Innovation Technologies was acquired by a larger company called Progressive Energy Solutions. Your grandfather received $2 million for the sale. $2 million, Caleb's eyes widened. Where did all that money go? Douglas's expression grew grim. That's where this story gets interesting. Progressive Energy Solutions was a subsidiary of Hargrove Holdings. Your grandfather sold his patents to Winston Hargrove's company 50 years ago. The revelation hit Garrett like a sledgehammer. Everything he'd believed about his grandfather's situation, about the family dynamics, about the current fight over the farmhouse, all of it had been built on lies and omissions stretching back half a century. But why would grandfather sell to them? Douglas produced another document, a private letter from Theodore to Winston Hargrove that had been preserved in the legal files because of its relevance to the transaction. Garrett read aloud from his grandfather's careful handwriting. Mr. Hargrove, I appreciate your family's commitment to developing my inventions responsibly. Your promise to use these technologies to help working families achieve energy independence aligns with my original vision. I trust that this partnership will ensure my life's work serves people rather than just profit. Winston promised to develop the technology for families, Caleb said, his young voice heavy with understanding. But he didn't do it, did he? Not only did he not develop it, Douglas replied, he buried it completely. Progressive Energy Solutions never manufactured a single device based on your grandfather's patents. They filed the patents away and let them sit unused for decades, while Theodore lived in poverty, believing his life's work had been stolen. Douglas pulled out a thick folder containing financial records and corporate documents. But here's the truly criminal part. Over the past 24 years, Hargrove Holdings has licensed aspects of your grandfather's patents to major energy companies. They've made over $120 million selling rights to technology they never developed themselves. $120 million. The number hung in the air like a physical presence, the same figure that had seemed impossibly large when Garrett first heard it, whispered by Fenwick during their initial meeting. It wasn't a projection of future value. It was the documented profit from 5 decades of exploiting Theodore's stolen innovations. So when they offered to buy the farmhouse for $250,000, Garrett said slowly, they were trying to pay us a fraction of what they've already stolen. Exactly. And there's more. Douglas opened his laptop and showed them recent corporate filings. Hargrove Holdings is preparing to sell those patent rights to a consortium of international energy companies for an estimated $500 million. The sale is scheduled to close next month. Caleb had been listening intently, and now he asked the question that cut to the heart of everything. But if great-grandpa sold the patents, don't they belong to the Hargrove Company now? Douglas smiled for the first time that morning. The first genuine expression of pleasure Garrett had seen from him since he'd arrived. That's where Winston Hargrove made his fatal mistake. He pulled out the original sales agreement from 1974 with a section highlighted in yellow marker. The sale agreement included a reversion clause. If Progressive Energy Solutions failed to develop and commercialize the technology within 25 years, all rights would automatically revert to Theodore Dawson or his legal heirs. Douglas let the implications sink in before continuing. 25 years expired in 1999. Winston Hargrove never developed anything. He never manufactured a single device. He never brought a single product to market. He just collected licensing fees while sitting on technology that could have helped millions of families. "So the patents belong to us?" Garrett asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not just the patents. All the profits Hargrove Holdings has made from licensing them since 1999. Under the terms of the reversion clause, they've been selling rights to technology they don't legally own for the past 24 years. That's patent fraud on a massive scale." The implications were staggering. They didn't just own patents worth hundreds of millions of dollars. They had legal grounds to recover decades of profits that Winston Hargrove had earned through systematic theft and deception. "How much?" Garrett asked. "How much could we recover?" Douglas consulted his notes. "Conservative estimate based on documented licensing fees alone, $127 million. If we can prove willful infringement and add punitive damages, it could be significantly more." Garrett sat back in his chair, overwhelmed by numbers that seemed to belong to someone else's life. Yesterday, he'd been worried about paying for roof repairs. Today, he was discussing legal strategies that could make his family wealthy beyond imagination. But Caleb brought him back to earth with a single question. "Dad, are we going to fight them?" Garrett looked at his son. Thought about Meredith's courage reflected in those dark eyes. Thought about Theodore's determination flowing through generations of Dawson men who refused to surrender to powerful interests. "Yes, buddy," he said. "We're going to fight them, and we're going to win." Outside the farmhouse windows, the November sky was darkening toward evening. A cold wind rattled the old windows and sent dead leaves skittering across the porch. The ancient oak tree swayed in the gusts, its bare branches reaching toward clouds that promised winter storms ahead. But inside, surrounded by the evidence of his grandfather's genius and the documentation of 50 years of corporate theft, Garrett Dawson felt something he hadn't experienced since his wife's death. Certainty. He knew who his enemies were now. He knew what they had done and what they were planning to do. And for the first time, he had the weapons to fight back. The battle for Theodore's legacy was about to begin. The federal courthouse in Houston rose against the April morning sky like a monument to the promise that justice could be found in America. Garrett Dawson stood on the marble steps, his best suit feeling tight across shoulders that had grown accustomed to work clothes and tool belts over the past 6 months. Beside him, Caleb wore a blazer that Sutton had helped them pick out the boy, looking older and more serious than any 9-year-old should have to look. 6 months of preparation had led to this moment. 6 months of sleepless nights studying his grandfather's documents. 6 months of learning legal terminology and patent law and corporate structure. 6 months of watching Douglas Whitmore build a case that would either restore Theodore's stolen legacy or leave them vulnerable to the full weight of Hargrove Holdings' legal retaliation. "You ready for this?" Douglas asked, joining them on the courthouse steps with his leather briefcase and the quiet confidence of a man who had fought similar battles before. "I've been ready since the night I found that hidden compartment," Garrett replied. "Theodore waited 50 years for someone to fight for his work. I'm not going to let him down." They entered the courthouse together, passing through security checkpoints and following signs to Courtroom 4B, where Judge Patricia Morrison would hear their case. The hallway outside the courtroom was already crowded with attorneys, journalists, and spectators who had learned about the case through legal trade publications and word of mouth. A patent dispute worth over $100 million attracted attention. A patent dispute involving one of Texas's most powerful business families attracted even more. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was charged with the kind of tension that surrounded high-stakes legal battles. Hargrove Holdings had brought a team of 8 attorneys led by Margaret Walsh, a legendary corporate defender known for her ability to make even the most damning evidence seem ambiguous. They occupied one side of the courtroom like an army preparing for war, their matching dark suits and expensive briefcases projecting wealth and power. On the other side sat Garrett, Caleb Douglas, and Sutton, who had insisted on being present for moral support. 4 people against a corporate empire. David against Goliath with everything on the line. Winston Hargrove himself sat at the defendant's table looking older than Garrett remembered from their confrontation at the farmhouse. The past 6 months had taken a toll on the patriarch. His silver hair seemed thinner. His commanding presence diminished by the weight of accusations he could no longer dismiss with a wave of his hand. Beside him sat Preston and Vivian Hargrove, their faces set in expressions of grim determination. They had tried everything to prevent this day from coming. Legal motions to dismiss, procedural challenges, requests for continuances that Judge Morrison had denied with increasing impatience. Now there was nowhere left to hide. Judge Morrison entered the courtroom at exactly 10 o'clock. Her black robes lending gravity to an already solemn proceeding. At 65, she had a reputation for fairness, intelligence, and absolute intolerance for legal theatrics that wasted the court's time. This matter concerns patent rights, contractual obligations, and allegations of corporate malfeasance, spanning 5 decades. She began, her voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. I expect both sides to present their cases clearly and concisely, focusing on facts rather than rhetoric. We will begin with opening statements. Douglas rose from his chair and approached the podium with the measured confidence of someone who had spent months preparing for this moment. He carried no notes. The facts of the case were burned into his memory. Your Honor, this case is about betrayal. It's about a brilliant inventor named Theodore Dawson, who spent his life developing technology that could have freed millions of American families from dependence on power companies. It's about a promise made and broken, a contract violated, and 50 years of profits stolen from a man who died believing his life's work had been taken from him. Douglas walked the judge through the timeline with surgical precision. Theodore's groundbreaking research in the 1960s, the patents filed in 1971, the sale to Progressive Energy Solutions in 1974, with Winston Hargrove's personal promise to develop the technology for ordinary families. Theodore Dawson trusted Winston Hargrove, Douglas said, his voice hardening. He sold his patents for $2 million, believing that his inventions would finally reach the people they were designed to help. Instead, Hargrove Holdings buried the technology, collected licensing fees, and let Theodore die in poverty, never knowing that his work had been exploited for decades. He turned to face the defendant's table directly. The contract between Theodore Dawson and Progressive Energy Solutions contained a reversion clause. If the technology was not commercialized within 25 years, all rights would return to the inventor or his heirs. That deadline passed in 1999, Since then, Hargrove Holdings has collected over $120 million in licensing fees for patents they no longer legally own. Douglas paused, letting the numbers sink in. We are here today to recover what was stolen. Not just money, but a legacy. Not just patents, but a promise that was made to a dying man and broken by people who valued profit over honor. Margaret Walsh's opening statement was equally polished, but took a different approach. She didn't deny the facts. Instead, she reframed them. Your Honor, Theodore Dawson was a brilliant inventor, but he was also a difficult man who made impractical demands and refused reasonable compromises. My clients purchased his patents in good faith, made significant investments in evaluating the technology, and concluded that it was not commercially viable given the market conditions of the time. She argued that the reversion clause was ambiguous, that good faith efforts had been made to develop the technology, and that the plaintiffs had waited too long to assert their claims. The truth is that Theodore Dawson's inventions were ahead of their time. The market wasn't ready. The infrastructure didn't exist. My clients made sound business decisions based on economic reality, not malice. Judge Morrison listened to both statements without expression, her pen moving steadily across her notepad. When Walsh finished, she looked up with sharp eyes that seemed to see through every legal argument to the truth beneath. We will proceed with evidence presentation. Mr. Whitmore, call your first witness. The morning session focused on technical evidence with expert witnesses explaining the revolutionary nature of Theodore's energy systems and documenting how they had influenced subsequent developments in the field. A professor from MIT testified that Theodore's patents contained innovations that were still being studied by researchers today. An engineer from the Department of Energy confirmed that the technology was viable and could have been commercialized decades ago if anyone had invested in its development. Caleb sat beside his father throughout the testimony, following the proceedings with the intense concentration he brought to any problem that mattered. He had helped organize the evidence they were presenting, had read his great-grandfather's journals more carefully than anyone, and understood the technical concepts better than most of the adults in the room. During the lunch break, Douglas gathered them in a small conference room to discuss strategy for the afternoon session. Walsh is going to focus on the reversion clause language, he explained. She'll try to convince the judge that commercialization doesn't require actual manufacturing, that their licensing activities constitute good faith efforts. We need to be ready with evidence that they never intended to develop the technology at all. What kind of evidence? Garrett asked. Internal corporate documents that show Hargrove Holdings viewed Theodore's patents as defensive acquisitions. Technology to be buried, not developed. Douglas smiled grimly. Fortunately, we have exactly that kind of evidence thanks to someone who decided that family loyalty had its limits. Colette Hargrove had provided them with internal emails and memos that painted a damning picture of corporate strategy. Documents showing that Hargrove executives had explicitly discussed suppressing Theodore's technology to protect their investments in traditional energy infrastructure. Our analysis indicates that widespread adoption of the Dawson energy systems could reduce demand for our core services by 60 to 70%, one memo stated. Recommendation: maintain patent control to prevent commercial development by competitors. The afternoon session began with Douglas presenting these documents to the court. Walsh objected repeatedly, arguing that the emails were taken out of context and misrepresented legitimate business planning. But Judge Morrison allowed them into evidence, and their impact was devastating to Hargrove Holdings's claims about good faith development efforts. The spectators in the gallery murmured as each new document was introduced. Journalists scribbled furiously in their notebooks. And at the defendant's table, Winston Hargrove's expression grew increasingly grim as the scope of his company's deception was laid bare. But the key moment came when Douglas called his final witness. "Your Honor," the plaintiff calls Winston Hargrove to the stand. A ripple of surprise ran through the courtroom. Calling the opposing party's patriarch as a witness was a bold move, one that could backfire spectacularly, if not handled carefully. But Douglas had spent months preparing for this moment, studying Winston's psychology, predicting his responses and planning questions that would leave no room for evasion. Winston approached the witness stand with the careful dignity of an old man who knew he was walking into a trap, but had no choice except to proceed. He was sworn in by the bailiff and took his seat, his cold blue eyes fixed on Douglas with undisguised hostility. "Mr. Hargrove, you personally negotiated the acquisition of Theodore Dawson's patents in 1974, is that correct?" "I was involved in the negotiations, yes." "And you personally promised Theodore that his technology would be developed to help ordinary families reduce their dependence on utility companies?" Winston's jaw tightened. "I made representations about our intentions at the time. Representations that you never intended to keep." "Objection," Walsh called out. "Counsel is putting words in the witness's mouth." "Sustained. Rephrase, Mr. Whitmore." Douglas nodded and adjusted his approach. "Mr. Hargrove, between 1974 and 1999, how much money did your company invest in developing Theodore Dawson's energy systems for commercial production?" Winston glanced at his attorneys before answering. "I don't have those figures in front of me. Let me help you." Douglas picked up a document from his table. "According to your own corporate records, Progressive Energy Solutions spent approximately $200,000 on initial technology assessment in 1975. And then nothing. Zero investment in development, manufacturing, or commercialization for the next 24 years. Market conditions weren't favorable for that type of technology. Market conditions." Douglas let the words hang in the air. "So your defense is that you couldn't find a market for technology that would eliminate electric bills for American families?" "It's more complicated than that." "Is it, or is it simple you bought Theodore Dawson's patents to prevent anyone else from developing them? You collected licensing fees while the technology sat unused. And you let a brilliant inventor die believing his life's work had been stolen." Winston's face reddened with anger. Theodore Dawson was a dreamer who didn't understand business realities. His technology was impractical. His demands were unreasonable, and his accusations against my company were the ravings of a bitter old man. The outburst hung in the courtroom like a thunderclap. Even Judge Morrison seemed taken aback by the venom in Winston's voice. Douglas let the silence stretch for several seconds before continuing. "Mr. Hargrove, since 1999, your company has collected over $120 million in licensing fees from patents that, under the terms of your own contract, should have reverted to Theodore Dawson's heirs. Is that correct?" "Our legal position is that the reversion clause does not apply." "That's not what I asked. I asked if you collected $120 million. Winston's attorneys shifted uncomfortably. There was no way to deny the documented financial records. The licensing revenue is a matter of public record. Yes or no, Mr. Hargrove? Did your company collect over $120 million from Theodore Dawson's patents after the reversion deadline had passed? Another long pause. Winston looked at his attorneys, at his son Preston, at the journalists filling the gallery. There was nowhere to hide. Yes. Douglas nodded slowly, letting the admissions settle over the courtroom. One final question, Mr. Hargrove. In 50 years of ownership, has your company ever manufactured a single device based on Theodore Dawson's patents? Have you ever produced anything that would help American families generate their own electricity and reduce their dependence on power companies? The question cut to the heart of everything. The reversion clause, the broken promises, the 50 years of exploitation and suppression. Winston Hargrove sat in the witness chair, surrounded by the wreckage of his legal strategy, facing a question he could not evade. His attorneys could not object. His wealth could not protect him. His power could not make the truth disappear. The silence stretched for 10 seconds, 20, 30. Winston looked at Garrett sitting at the plaintiff's table with his 9-year-old son. He looked at Caleb, whose dark eyes held the same stubborn determination that Theodore Dawson must have possessed. He looked at the journalists and spectators and attorneys who were waiting for his answer. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he spoke the word that would end 50 years of deception. No. The courtroom erupted. Journalists rushed for the doors to file their stories. Spectators gasped and whispered. Margaret Walsh dropped her head into her hands, while her team of attorneys exchanged looks of defeat. Judge Morrison gavelled for order, her voice cutting through the chaos. This court will recess until tomorrow morning, at which time I will deliver my ruling. All parties are dismissed. The night before the verdict felt longer than any night Garrett had ever experienced. He sat in the farmhouse kitchen with Caleb, surrounded by the documents that had consumed their lives for 6 months. The proof-of-concept device hummed quietly in the workshop outside, generating electricity from invisible forces, just as it had since they'd first discovered it. Theodore's legacy still working after all these years. Dad, do you think we're going to win? Garrett looked at his son, at the boy who had stood beside him through every challenge, every threat, every moment of doubt. Caleb had grown in ways that couldn't be measured in inches. He had learned to research, to organize, to think critically about complex problems. He had faced down a billionaire patriarch and refused to be intimidated. I think we already have, buddy. Whatever happens tomorrow, we told the truth. We fought for what was right, and we honored your great-grandfather's memory. But the money would help, right? Garrett smiled. Yeah, the money would help. But it's not about the money. It's about making sure Theodore's inventions finally reach the people he designed them for. That's what matters. They sat together in comfortable silence, father and son, watching the stars appear through the kitchen window. The farmhouse had been transformed over the past months. The roof no longer leaked. The electrical system had been updated. The heating worked properly. They had poured every spare dollar into making the place habitable, and it had become more than just a house. It had become home. The call came at 7:30 the next morning. Douglas's voice was calm, but Garrett could hear the excitement beneath his professional demeanor. The judge is ready to deliver her ruling. Court convenes at 10. This is it, Garrett. They arrived at the courthouse to find an even larger crowd than the day before. News of Winston Hargrove's admission had spread through legal circles and media outlets, attracting attention from journalists across the country. A patent dispute that had started as a local story was becoming national news. Inside the courtroom, the tension was almost unbearable. Winston Hargrove sat at the defendant's table looking like a man who hadn't slept in days. His attorneys surrounded him like guards around a fallen king, their expensive suits and confident demeanors unable to hide the desperation in their eyes. At exactly 10 o'clock, Judge Morrison entered the courtroom and took her seat. She had clearly spent the night preparing her ruling, and her expression suggested she intended to deliver it without ceremony. This case presents fundamental questions about the relationship between individual innovation and corporate power. She began, her voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. The court has carefully considered the evidence, the applicable law, and the long-term consequences of its decision. She reviewed the facts methodically, walking through Theodore's original inventions, his decision to trust Hargrove Holdings, and the subsequent 50 years of patent suppression and corporate profiteering. Her recitation was clinical but devastating to the defense's position. The defendant argues that its licensing activities constitute good faith efforts to commercialize the plaintiff's technology. The court finds this argument wholly without merit. Garrett felt Caleb's hand slip into his small fingers, gripping tightly. The evidence clearly demonstrates that Hargrove Holdings acquired the Dawson patents with no intention of developing them for public benefit. Internal corporate communications explicitly discuss suppressing the technology to protect existing business interests. No manufacturing facilities were established. No development programs were initiated. No products were ever brought to market. Judge Morrison's voice grew stern as she addressed the defendants directly. This court finds that Hargrove Holdings violated both the letter and spirit of its 1974 agreement with Theodore Dawson. The reversion clause was unambiguous. Failure to commercialize within 25 years would return all rights to the inventor or his heirs. The defendant failed to meet this obligation. She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle over the courtroom. Therefore, this court hereby orders that all patent rights to the Dawson regenerative energy system immediately revert to Garrett Dawson and Caleb Dawson as the lawful heirs of Theodore Dawson. Furthermore, Hargrove Holdings is ordered to cease all licensing activities and prepare a full accounting of profits generated from these patents since 1999. The courtroom stirred with whispered reactions, but Judge Morrison wasn't finished. Additionally, the court finds that Hargrove Holdings' conduct constitutes willful patent infringement and unjust enrichment. The company is hereby ordered to pay restitution of $127 million, representing the full amount of licensing revenue generated through unauthorized use of the plaintiff's intellectual property. $127 million. The number echoed through the courtroom like a thunderclap. Journalists rushed for the exits to file their stories. Spectators gasped and applauded, despite the judge's call for order. At the defendant's table, Winston Hargrove sat frozen, his face pale, his hands trembling. Margaret Walsh rose immediately. "Your Honor, the defendants respectfully request a stay of this order pending appeal. The financial implications denied." Judge Morrison's voice was firm. The defendants have profited from stolen intellectual property for 24 years. They can begin making restitution immediately while pursuing whatever appeals they deem appropriate. She turned to address Douglas directly. Counselor, please coordinate with the court's financial officers to establish appropriate mechanisms for asset transfer and ongoing monitoring of compliance. As the judge prepared to conclude the proceedings, she delivered one final observation that would be quoted in legal journals for years to come. This case serves as a reminder that innovation belongs to innovators, not to those with the power to suppress it. The court will not allow corporate theft to be legitimized through the passage of time. Theodore Dawson spent his life trying to help ordinary families achieve energy independence. Today, 50 years after his work was stolen, justice is finally served. The gavel fell with the finality of thunder, and the courtroom exploded into controlled chaos. Douglas guided Garrett and Caleb through the crowd of reporters and well-wishers to a small conference room where they could process what had just happened. The walk felt surreal, as if Garrett were watching someone else's life unfold in slow motion. "We won," Caleb said, his voice filled with wonder. "We actually won." "You did more than win," Douglas replied, his professional composure finally cracking into a genuine smile. "You achieved one of the largest patent settlements in American history, but more importantly, you restored your great-grandfather's reputation and ensured his inventions will finally reach the people he meant them to help." The weeks following the verdict passed in a blur of media interviews, legal paperwork, and the surreal experience of suddenly being wealthy beyond anything Garrett had ever imagined. Hargrove Holdings, facing SEC investigations triggered by Judge Morrison's ruling, agreed to an expedited settlement, rather than pursue lengthy appeals that would keep their corporate malfeasance in the headlines. The full $127 million was transferred within 30 days, along with all technical documentation that Hargrove Holdings had accumulated over 50 years of patent ownership. Winston Hargrove resigned from his company's board of directors, retreating from public life under a cloud of scandal that would define his legacy. Preston and Vivian Hargrove quietly dropped their custody threats, recognizing that any judge in the country would now view their attempts to take Caleb as what they had always been: vindictive harassment of a father who had done nothing wrong except refuse to surrender. Colette Hargrove, who had risked everything to provide the internal documents that had proven the case publicly, broke with her family and reached out to Garrett with a simple message of congratulations and hope for the future. The farmhouse was transformed. Not just repaired, but restored to everything Theodore had dreamed it could be. Solar panels covered the south-facing roof. Battery banks stored power in a newly constructed basement facility. And in the workshop, Theodore's full-scale energy system was finally built according to his original specifications, providing electricity for the entire property without any connection to the power grid. Garrett established Dawson Energy Solutions with a simple mission statement that echoed his grandfather's original vision: energy independence for American families. The company would manufacture Theodore's devices and sell them at prices ordinary people could afford, with financing programs for families who couldn't pay up front. The first 1,200 customers signed up within a month. Many of them were single parents, elderly couples on fixed incomes, and working families who had struggled with utility bills for years. Each installation represented not just a commercial transaction, but the fulfillment of a promise made 50 years ago and finally kept. 6 months after the verdict, Sutton Whitmore stood beside Garrett on the farmhouse porch, watching Caleb climb the ladder to his new treehouse. The massive oak tree spread its branches over them like a blessing, its leaves rustling in the warm October breeze. Theodore would have loved this, Sutton said, her hand finding Garrett's. Seeing his technology finally helping people. Seeing his family thriving on the land he loved. I wish I could have known him better. Garrett replied, I have these vague memories from childhood watching his hands work in the workshop. But I never understood what he was building or why it mattered. Caleb will understand. He already does in a lot of ways. They had become more than friends over the past months. Sutton had been there through every crisis, every triumph, every moment of doubt and determination. She had helped Caleb with his homework while Garrett studied legal documents late into the night. She had brought meals when they forgot to eat and encouragement when they were ready to give up. She had become family in all the ways that mattered. There's something I need to show you, Garrett said, leading her inside to the workshop where Theodore's proof of concept device still hummed quietly on its shelf. He had found the letter 2 days ago, hidden in a false bottom of Theodore's workbench that they had somehow missed during all their months of searching. The envelope was yellowed with age, addressed in his grandfather's careful handwriting to my future family. Garrett opened the envelope and read aloud, If you're reading this letter, it means you found my work and fought for it. I always knew someone would come. Someone with the courage to challenge the powerful interests that tried to steal my dreams. Someone who understood that innovation should serve people, not just profit. I spent my life trying to free families from the burden of electric bills. I wanted every home in America to generate its own power, to be independent of corporations that charged them for something that should be as free as the air they breathe. The technology works. I proved it 1,000 times in this workshop. But proving something works and bringing it to the world are two different battles. I lost my battle. The men with money and lawyers and connections were too powerful for one old inventor working alone. They took my patents with promises they never intended to keep. And they left me here to grow old and bitter while they profited from my life's work. But I never stopped believing that someone in my family would pick up where I left off. I hid my research because I knew the truth would survive even if I didn't. And I trusted that when the time was right, a Dawson would find it and finish what I started. Whoever you are, whatever challenges you face to reach this moment, know that I am proud of you. You have honored my memory and vindicated my life's work. The technology is yours now. Use it well. Help the families I could never help. Build the future I could only dream about. And take care of that old oak tree. Your grandmother used to climb it when she was a little girl. She said she could see the whole world from up there. With love across the years, Theodore Dawson. Garrett's voice broke on the final words. Sutton wrapped her arms around him, holding him as the emotions of 6 months finally found release. He knew, she whispered. He knew someone would come. Dad. Caleb's voice rang out from the treehouse. Dad, you have to see this. I can see the whole world from up here. Garrett wiped his eyes and walked outside with Sutton, looking up at his son, silhouetted against the October sky. The boy was leaning over the treehouse railing, his face bright with joy, pointing toward the horizon, where the sun was setting in shades of gold and crimson. "Come up here," Caleb called. "Both of you. You can see forever." They climbed the ladder together, joining Caleb in the treehouse that Theodore had never lived to see, but had somehow known would exist. The view was everything the old man had promised. Rolling hills stretched toward distant mountains. The farmhouse stood proud and restored below them, and beyond the property line they could see the lights of neighboring homes beginning to flicker on as evening settled over the land. "Some of those houses have our energy systems now," Caleb said, pointing toward a cluster of homes in the distance. "They don't have to pay electric bills anymore because of great-grandpa's inventions." "That's right, buddy. And more families will get them soon. Many more. Thousands of families. Maybe millions eventually." Caleb was quiet for a moment, his young face thoughtful in the fading light. "Great-grandpa said he could never help the families he wanted to help. But we're helping them now, right? We're finishing what he started." Garrett pulled his son close, feeling Theodore's legacy flowing through generations of Dawson men who refused to surrender to powerful interests. "Yes, Caleb, we're finishing what he started." Sutton took Garrett's other hand, completing the circle. Below them, the farmhouse glowed with lights powered by Theodore's technology. Above them, stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. And all around them, the land that had sheltered Theodore's secrets for 50 years seemed to breathe with satisfaction. The battle was over. The truth had prevailed. And somewhere, Garrett knew a brilliant inventor was finally at peace. "I kept my promise, Meredith," he whispered, thinking of his wife's dying words. "I kept him safe. I kept him with me, and we built something beautiful together." The oak tree swayed gently in the evening breeze, its ancient branches cradling the treehouse where 3 people sat watching the stars appear. A father who had learned to fight, a son who had learned to believe, and a woman who had helped them both find their way home. Theodore Dawson's legacy was secure. His technology was reaching families across America, and in the farmhouse he had built with his own hands on the land he had loved all his life, his great-grandson was learning to see the whole world from the branches of an oak tree that had sheltered generations of dreamers. Some inheritances are measured in money, some are measured in courage, and some, the most precious of all, are measured in the love that passes from one generation to the next, carrying dreams forward into a future that the dreamer will never see, but somehow always believed would come.